Okay, maybe we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I'd like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We have folks from all over the world joining us today. Hello, and welcome to San Diego State University and the Fowler College of Business. My name is Mark Ballum. I serve as Managing Director of our Wendy Gillespie Center for Advancing Global Business. Our center is a dynamic hub of international business education and innovation. Established in 2019, our center is committed to fostering global competence among students, enriching faculty expertise, and driving business growth in the greater San Diego region and beyond. Our mission is to equip leaders of tomorrow with the skills needed to navigate the challenges and opportunities of an increasingly globally connected world. The Wendy Gillespie Center is pleased to host this annual global risk forecast. We hope the insights shared here will not only deepen understanding, but also empower companies to enhance their ability to compete globally. To learn more about the Wendy Gillespie Center and to see how you can engage with us and support our work, please click on the link provided in the chat box. Now, before we begin, I want to send a special shout out to our center's board member and San Diego State alumnus, Greg Hubler, and his team at Sibylline, and thank them for helping organize today's event. Today's attendees can receive a copy of Sibylline's 2024 Global Risk Forecast by emailing Greg at the email posted in the chat box. Now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Martina Musteeen. She is the Charles W. Hostler Professor of Global Business in the Fowler College of Business, and she's faculty director of the Wendy Gillespie Center for Advancing Global Business. Professor Musteeen will be the moderator for today's webinar, and I'm happy to turn the program over to her now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. The Fowler College is extremely pleased to partner with Sibylline today for the 2024 Global Risk Forecast. As we all know, 2023 brought about some additional geopolitical complexity with the ongoing war in Ukraine, with the October 7th events in Israel, and with many countries going into election this coming year. I don't expect that 2024 will be uneventful. And so to get greater understanding of what we may be up for, we have our guest here, Mr. Justin Crump, the founder and chief executive officer at Sibylline Limited, a strategic risk advisory firm. Justin comes to us from Sibylline Global Headquarters in London. Justin, it is a pleasure to welcome you to San Diego State University. We look forward to your insight. Please take it from there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you to those of you who may have attended this presentation we actually did a year ago on the topics of what to look out for last year. And we obviously did an okay job if you're prepared to have us back. So team, thank you very much for allowing us to spread more doom and gloom on this February day to all of you all around the world. As you've said, it is set to be quite a year. I'm aware I said that last year. I don't think I was wrong. I think I've said it for the last few years. And before that, I was warning people there were a lot of things that were going to come in the global environment, not least a global pandemic, that were going to affect the way in which we live our lives and have very large ramifications for the future. Stepping back, I think the thing I would want you all to understand, I think you do understand it very well, I suspect, if you're anything like normal people I speak to, we are at the end of the peace dividend. So the period of post-Cold War history now, where the benefits of the end of the Cold War were felt, and we've all experienced that in terms of globalization. Frankly, the ease of doing global business since 1990, the fundamental absence of ideological conflicts that we've had in the world since really the collapse of communism, the collapse of the Soviet ideal, and if you like, immediately the triumph of the American-led world. And when I started at university in the 1990s, the thesis at the time, or one of the two competing theses at the time by Francis Fukuyama, was the end of history argument that actually with the triumph of the United States and its democratic allies, liberal democracy had won as the best human system. It would not face further challenges, and it was just a steady move towards an increasingly democratic and liberal shared future for the planet with benefits for all. I spoke to Francis Fukuyama about this, in fact, at a lecture he gave, and even he didn't believe it. But at the time, it was quite hard to see alternatives. Now, those of you who might have military experience, or certainly anyone who's watched the news over the last 20 years, will know we've still been quite busy in a lot of parts of the world, the military front. And so sometimes it comes as a surprise to those of us who serve that actually this is a relatively peaceful period of human history. But it really has been. It's been an extraordinarily peaceful period. And if you look at some of the graphs about deaths in armed conflict around the world since the end of the Second World War, the period from the 1990s through to about 2020 was particularly low, especially given the amount of things that we knew were going on, for example, the rise of ISIS and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Actually, fundamentally, the world was a very peaceful place and largely unified in its direction. And those of us who've been in business since about 1990 have seen the benefits of that. And of course, at this stage, that's most of the senior people in business have actually had their whole careers, or certainly people under their mid-50s have had their whole careers in a period of relative stability, relative peace and prosperity, and arguably one of the best times ever in human history to be alive. So it's slightly sad that we're at the end of that period, but you have to understand, of course, that the wheel of history turns, and we were never going to be the generation that avoided hardship and conflict and these other challenges. So it was only natural that we would come across times where life, frankly, was not so easy, where business decisions were not so easy, where barriers against global trade were not so low. And actually, for leaders, I mean, this is the time, and I'll start with a positive before we go into all the other things. But for leaders, this is a time when you can really stand out, because if you can navigate your organization, whatever it is, be it a military, be it a government, be it a business or an NGO or anything, in this environment, then there are bigger rewards to be won. It does effectively sort out the people with real talent when the challenge is on, in a way you don't have when the playing field is level and everything is easy and business is formulaic, which I would argue it has been for a long period of time. And that's been particularly helped by a very permissive investment environment, interest rates and other things. Now, there have been economic challenges, of course, 2008, most obviously, and this weird period of the new normal that so far has lasted until the last couple of years. Again, most middle managers' entire careers lived in a period that's actually economically extraordinarily unusual. But nonetheless, again, it has been not the best grounds for those people trying to understand global risks and find a way to navigate it. And to go back to my opening statement, I spent a lot of time, I think, from when I started the business in 2010, and I started in this field in the private sector in 2007. A lot of the early years were spent trying to get people to understand that world risks were even really a thing, that this wasn't a tactical issue related to security, say in Pakistan, and the risk of kidnapping or potentially the chances of a terrorist attack or something like this. Is actually, there could be very large fractures in the way we do business on the planet and the way we can operate in global consensus and the approach to life and the world. I think all of you have seen enough, I'm sure, on the news by this point to agree with me that those things have changed. The signs of change, though, were evident some period of time below, nearly 10 years before, I think, and the present. And you can see those cracks beginning to emerge. And I liken it to the idea that if you stack empty glasses on top of each other on the bar, you eventually get to the point that that tower is going to topple, and you can keep stacking them, but at some point it's one too many. You can think of a game of Jenga or anything else you like. You can keep taking bricks away, and eventually the thing goes, but it doesn't go at first. It doesn't go for the first few removals of bricks or stacked glasses. And the reason I mention that is it's not always the first crisis that gets organizations. It's sometimes not the second one. It's when you start to get these pressures mounting on top of each other that you get a cascading problem, and it's much harder for organizations to deal with that. And that probably is the atmosphere we're in at the moment. There are a lot of things that have gone on since 2020. You can extend that back to 2016, certainly as well, with some of the first sort of shockwaves from President Trump's victory then, and how that affected people's sentiment towards alliances being permanent, towards the way the world had been for several decades, continuing without challenge. And of course, some would cheer that disruption and some will fear it. But nonetheless, that was a really evident moment that actually maybe Europe in particular couldn't take things for granted. And the period of post-Second World War prosperity that Europe had enjoyed was coming to an end. So in that is the big picture with that. And really, I would say it's back to the old school. This is the way that most of human history has been. This is the environment that our former political leaders and business leaders and military leaders would have found quite familiar to us, of course, after 30 years of peace and quiet, which in the scope of the history books is almost a blink of an eye when you go back a couple of centuries. If I talked to you about something happening in 1810 and then 1840, you probably wouldn't appreciate what the 30 years in between looked like for the people who lived through it. But for us, it's been most of our careers, if not all of them. And most of our political leaders and others, it's been all of their careers, have been in this sort of unrealistic environment. So are we prepared for this change? And I'd say intellectually, people have spotted this coming. I was hardly alone in talking about the threat, or the many threats and risks that were mounting and the pressures one could see mounting, political and otherwise. But if you look particularly at NATO spending, for example, and military spending in a lot of countries outside the US, there was a very clear view that military prioritization for Western democracies was not a priority. Healthcare has definitely adopted the spending mantle that once upon a time the military had. If you go back 50, 60 years, military spending was probably where healthcare is now as a percentage of GDP in most countries, and vice versa. We have elderly populations, we have requirements for increasing care. We are increasingly good at caring for people. In fact, the fact that we can keep people alive longer, keep babies alive through childbirth, keep mothers alive through childbirth, is one of the reasons we have a burgeoning population. And of course, that's bringing its own problems in terms of climate change and migration. But we aren't really prepared because I think, particularly to current generations, an increase in military spending is almost an anathema. Again, those of you in the United States probably more content with the idea of military spending as being something to be proud of. But certainly for Europe and other countries, and even the UK in recent years, and following failed conflicts, arguably in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular, there's sort of that feeling of wariness about the military, and also it's seen as a bit distasteful to be undertaking military action anyway. And that's been fed by a lot of things, but certainly for younger generations, security spending, defense spending is sort of seen as bad. This is all bad, and it's not something you should have to do. I'm aware that there are many shades of that view, and I don't want to speak for anyone on the call, but I hope it's a trend that one would notice if you thought about your own groups of friends and contacts and just what you also see and read in general. So I would argue we're not really prepared for this, and we were extraordinarily lucky, I think, that people pulled together 2 years ago in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine to implement sanctions against Russia. And that is something that the White House did not expect to go as well as it had done. It was pretty depressing that 2 years ago this week, the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and the Secretary General of NATO were all briefing that Russia was absolutely coming for Ukraine. And if you think back, there was vast skepticism that they were telling the truth, because Vladimir Putin said that he was not coming for Ukraine, and therefore he was to be believed, and those other figures should not be. And I think there's no greater encapsulation of our sort of intellectual unpreparedness and the fact we found ourselves in that situation. And European intelligence agencies in particular were caught in that. And I had conversation with a number of them as to why they did not predict an invasion, that even to my own firm sitting on the outside, we were able to predict to the extent of seeing which roads the Russians were going to attack down and what their objectives were. Why did the European intelligence agencies not believe this would happen? And the answer I got back from several, from people that I'd spoken to before the invasion and after it, was that they couldn't accept that any nation would sacrifice its economic prosperity for something, if you like, as tawdry as land or glory or seizing bits of other people's countries or ethnicity or anything like that. And I think it shows how far the mindset have come, that business is all, that GDP is the only measure that matters for human development. And that is probably poisonous to our thinking. Unfortunately, 2 years on, we haven't really done enough about that mindset. There's been a lot of talk about things. And I think because Ukraine was initially quite successful at throwing back Russia, and the Russian forces showed themselves to be less capable than they themselves had believed, and therefore we believed, because they believed it, that actually everything was going to be okay and this was a blip. And of course, late last year, we saw that actually not only was Russia able to dig in for the long term, but we have further crises emerging. And the action against Israel in October last year by Hamas was almost certainly not part of any sort of wider sophisticated plot. But of course, the consequences are strongly interrelated. And I think this is just one more reminder of just how dangerous the world is getting. What we've managed throughout this is escalation management, and I think that's a great trend. And US diplomacy has gone rather unappreciated actually during this conflict, because in general it's been truly exceptional in terms of actually keeping the lid on situations that could have boiled over much further. There is an argument the US could show more resolve that obviously some people wish to make, but it's a very difficult situation. And on balance, the US is navigating it at present along with its allies, fewer as they might be than the US would wish, or the allies would wish. But it is nonetheless commendable that we haven't seen things boil over further, but we are in a situation of gradual deterioration, and the risks amounting not of deliberate action, deliberate warfare, but as so often happens, they slide towards conflict because there are mounting pressures, there are mounting concerns, there are mounting trigger points. And so when we're briefing clients, we talk about the unholy trinity, which is the fate of Ukraine, which currently is sitting broadly in a situation of stalemate. Russia, frankly, at this point, digging in for the longer term, hoping they can outlast Western resolve, and with great signs that they possibly will be able to do that to them, and at least push things out to the US presidential elections, so they know what they're dealing with after that. And definitely there is nothing in it for Russia to give up this year, and they're not under sufficient pressure to do so. Conversely, Ukraine beginning to doubt whether its support will last into a third year of the conflict, and what that looks like, or if they'll start to be isolated and forced to come to terms. The second pillar is what's going on in the Middle East. Again, that conflict is widening, but there is a lot of effort to stop it from truly escalating. There are a number of reasons that Iran does not want a wider conflict, despite being the sponsor of much of what we see. To be honest, they gain much more from being a threat in waiting than from a direct confrontation with the United States and allies. And they are playing a careful game on this. And the US has been quite careful and proportionate in its military response to threats. I would argue, again, other people might say that more resolve should have been shown, but I think it's towed a balance in terms of showing that the US and allies won't be pushovers, but neither are they warmongers. We're not seeking relentlessly to escalate these conflicts. And in the current global environment, there's a certain argument, if you want to have a big fight, you can have one. And Russia could equally have one with NATO if they so wished. They have been very careful to avoid that, and even the appearance of that, despite talking about it, despite wanting to get our media talking about it, despite claiming they're fighting all of NATO in Ukraine. The Russian leadership know for an absolute fact they are not. So I think when you push all that together, again, everyone's aware of the risk. People are trying to steer clear, but do bear in mind that Hitler did not intend to start the First World War with the invasion of Poland. If he had understood the consequences of it, they would not have proceeded in that way at that time. It wasn't part of his plan at that time to have a wider conflict. It happened anyway. And that is not the first case of a slide to war. And obviously we've seen that over 100 years ago also, where the world got dragged into a conflict everyone said could not happen because of economic interdependence. So when you hear those arguments being thrown around, for example, the US and China, I think it's wise to be skeptical. These things can happen. Moreover, conflict in this era can happen in such a way, even between nuclear powers, that it does not go nuclear. And we've seen quite careful management of the nuclear element in this. What nuclear weapons offer is the fact that ultimately you can't get wiped out losing a conflict, but of course you can lose within terms that you're willing to accept. For example, the United States in Vietnam, arguably. And you're seeing that in a lot of the conflicts that are happening around the world, plus the use of proxies, nations in conflict being able to stand back and operate at arm's length. And that sort of trend means that you can see a wider conflict emerging, but of course it doesn't necessarily mean that the big players are trading shots. So the third part of that unholy trinity linked to that then, so if you go with Ukraine and then escalation into what's happening in the Middle East, the mounting pressures, the third thing that eyes are on are China and Taiwan. China does not intend to go for Taiwan head on. It absolutely wants to reassimilate the island. It's a very important point to the Chinese, but ultimately they're going to try and do it in cleverer ways, linked again to that, if you like, grey zone warfare, use of proxies, the operations in the maritime domain, for example, the building of islands and bases in the South China Sea that's been going on for China strategically over a number of years, really without the ability to completely hedge that in. We've put pressure on them around it, but we've not stopped China from developing its island bases. And those sorts of tactics, so slow and steady, if you like, wins the race for China. However, there is a scenario whereby the US fails spectacularly, say in the Middle East, and is dragged into conflict there, where we fail spectacularly in Ukraine, and Russia wins that conflict outright. And we are seen to have failed, arguably yet another ally, adding to, for example, the Afghan government and others that over the years our adversaries would say we had sold out or been poor partners to. And within that, there is an argument that Chinese planning would suggest that, okay, they hadn't planned to do something around Taiwan at this point in time. As ever, there are pros and cons. And while they may not be totally ready, this is a time of relative advantage, and it would be foolish to wait. I think that is the least likely outcome of things at present. I believe that the Chinese, like most others, will wait and see what's happening in the future. But for now, definitely, that is something that is looming and is vitally important. So if you add the US elections to that, which seems to be where everything heads up to, isn't it? It's November this year. What is going to happen around that is going to have the huge ramifications. I think there is a pause here while nations test and adjust. Now, things can happen in the meantime that advance a conflict or force an escalation that no one wanted or planned for. But really, to me, this is the moment that most nations, that most actors are waiting for, is to see which way the US goes and what that means for the future in November. And different players see different advantage and different outcomes within that. So whatever happens, it's going to embolden some people if Biden continues, say, or it's going to embolden others if Trump continues, and that will change decision making. And again, it would be a slightly odd nation, I think, that would seek to move at this moment in time before the election, unless they saw an advantage in trying to bring about a particular outcome. And of course, some nations might see that. They will therefore almost certainly interfere as much as they can directly in elections by attacking our understanding of our own systems, as we've seen before, by generating mistrust. That is something they seek to do, and spreading contrarian narratives, if you like, to try and effectively demoralize us. And that has also been a factor in our military thinking over recent years, or the way in which civil life thinks about the military in recent years. And ultimately, of course, more directly in a way to influence elections by conducting events on the world stage that demand a response. And they're trying to generate responses that may bring about a more favorable outcome for a government they might wish to see in power. And of course, that's just the US election. There are nearly 70 others planned around the world at the moment. Of course, that can change. Some can get brought forward, some can get delayed, but we're anticipating around 70 elections this year. It is technically the biggest ever year for democracy on the planet. I think a number of them are less than truly democratic. Someone described the planned Russian presidential election to me as a electoral event. They said, I'm not going to call it an election, it's an electoral staged event. But nonetheless, there's a lot of uncertainty here as a result, and there could be a lot of change in a lot of areas. And while we've got our eyes on the big prizes, if you like, and the most obvious competitions, we shouldn't forget that the outcome of elections across South Asia, for example, could ignite tensions and conflicts in that region. And again, in this very febrile and stretched international environment with a largely moribund UN, could rapidly cause wider disruption. And of course, we are fragile in many parts of the world. Our sea lanes are challenged. The busiest strait pretty much in the world is off Taiwan. That is one of the most important shipping lanes, if you were to pick one in the world, is going past the island for most of that. And if you look at others, of course, one of the most other important ones was not just Hormuz, but through the Red Sea and through Suez. And we're already feeling the ramifications of disruption there, which is on a comparatively minor scale. Also for air traffic, there are from Europe and the UK, there are two routes, because we can't fly over Russia now, to the Far East and Southeast Asia and Australasia. One is effectively along, you go through Turkey and you go down the Iran-Iraq border and then down the Gulf. And the other route is down the Red Sea. They are very narrow corridors that are still permitted for flights. Everything else is shut off due to the threat levels, including large chunks of Africa, across the Sahel and areas like that. And if there is further disruption to either of those areas, then the air routes are effectively closed. And from London to Sydney, you'll be traveling via Kenya. So, even just global travel getting severely restricted by air, and of course, maritime as well. So we're already seeing some consequences, but these things could get worse. And we live in a world, of course, of just-in-time supply chains. It's been efficient for businesses to have things come just when we want them. So Jaguar Land Rover, for example, a part DHL are contracted to get a part as required to the factory, no more than 4 hours ahead of when it's needed, no later than 20 minutes before when it's needed. There is a small window where the part arrives, it sits very briefly in storage, and then it's put on the car. In the ideal world, it would arrive and someone would come running up with it just as the person on the assembly line turned around and wanted it. We love this in business because it's efficient. We've cut things back to the bone. The problem with all this is there is no resilience in our supply chains, and we saw this during COVID. We're going to see some of it again now. And of course, when shipping costs start to mount, as they already have done, up very significantly since the start of the year for certain routes, particularly from China, and of course, we're effectively losing around 5% of global shipping capacity due to longer routes, that is driving increasing costs straight away. And of course, there is no plan B. You're going to pay the price it takes your container to arrive. That gets passed on to consumers. That's going to impact markets, and you can see the disruption from that. So I want to give you a number of themes to think about more widely. I've given you kind of the central scenario, if you like, on my pitch, which is that we are in a pretty bad place. We have mounted risks, and we are definitely heading towards time with the potential for more widespread conflict, though I would say that's not inevitable. And I'm happy to address the World War III question I'll inevitably get during questions. But I want to give you some other themes that are driving all of this. And I'd love to go into all the world risks. There are far too many of those. But as we said at the start, you are most welcome to a copy of our global risk forecast, which goes through in depressing detail a large number of world risks across all regions. So you can really dig into your favorite sort of topics of choice, or else go through it with a highlighter and pick out the things that are relevant to your business and interests. So that's what I recommend. That should helpfully see you think into second or third orders. We don't have time to go through all that today. Again, have a cup of coffee or a stiff gin and tonic, depending on how you feel about it, and go through that and extract your notes. But the 6 themes I want you to think about. The first one I've alluded to already in the elections, which is political polarization and the erosion of trust. Our adversaries have attacked our integrity. They've attacked our belief in ourselves, in our systems, in our leadership, in our media. And we've done a lot of this to ourselves as well. But don't kid yourselves, this has not been driven in part by the way our adversaries are stirring the pot. It's in their vested interest to make it much harder to carry on promoting the idea of Western liberal democracy. Again, not everyone agrees that it's the ultimate victor in human history. And there are plenty of people who see the loopholes for tearing it down, and they are exploiting that. There are many other factors driving the divisions that are so evident, sadly, in our society at present. But nonetheless, this is going to affect all of those elections that we talked about. In a way, there's no such thing as a free and fair election now, because with the growth of social media and other things, it's so easy for people to target and broadcast messaging, and that's not even organized actors. Just the way in which misinformation can spread and disinformation can spread and affect our integrity. And of course, that affects issues large and small. It affects businesses as much as anyone else in the way in which messages are being passed, targeted, and what people actually believe. And we should bear in mind, we live in a world where I think more people than ever, certainly since ancient times, and despite spacecraft and aircraft, believe the world is flat. You know, that is a chilling thought to sit here in 2024 and acknowledge that that is a growing belief movement. And that is just one of many bizarre things that people are starting to take to be true with relatively little challenge, and mindsets that won't be challenged in certain schools of thought. And that's something that's going to be very hard to break. It'll get worse as technology improves and our adversaries push at the door of that. The second one, and slightly related to people's views and things, is the impact of a changing climate. I deliberately use those words because the word climate change itself, often elicits reactions to people. Whatever reason it happens, it doesn't really matter, what you believe or don't believe. I mean, it is happening, and it will have impacts. We're already seeing those impacts. You might be seeing them yourselves if you're in San Diego at the moment, at least in part, with atmospheric rivers and deep joy like that. We've seen it in the UK with disruption to weather patterns. There is a lot more energy within the North Atlantic alone. We are in an El Nino period, which is exacerbating global weather trends, but without doubt, the climate is changing. The consequences of that, not fully understood, but it's certainly not going to help our current situation. It's going to create challenges in terms of food supply, in terms of water supply. It'll help drive population movement, competition over resources, and it'll have a number of long-term impacts of course, in the way and where we live on the planet over time. And the great challenge of this is it's not changing fast enough that we notice. This is quite literally a boiling frog issue where the temperature is gradually rising, but we have so many other things to deal with and so many more immediate things that we can't deal with this particular area as well as we probably should. I think we learned during COVID just how well the world can really pull together. And of course, it's a much more disrupted world now than then, and priorities are more pressing. Add some skepticism over things like net zero and policies around that, some backsliding on those because nations just can't afford some of these policies anymore in the short term, even though that might be harmful in the long term. And you can see that we have a recipe for long-term disruption from all that. Global economic certainty, I won't labor on. I mean, the economies have actually bounced back better than one would expect, and there have been opportunities in the post-COVID era. But there are some quite strong legacies and weaknesses that are still in the system that haven't washed out as a result of disruption during COVID, and indeed some of the circumstances leading up to that. So we are far from the sunlit uplands of happy economies. There are systematic weaknesses, and there are a number of areas where we're very vulnerable to shocks. And uncertainty will remain. We do seem to be staying the right side of economic recovery in general, certainly in Western Europe, albeit not necessarily in Germany, but in a lot of other parts of Western Europe, in the UK, Scandinavia, United States, and others, generally weathering the storm and keeping things going. There is an argument that there are some big hollows within that. I guess the economy was always a bit like that, but nonetheless, we're going okay. It doesn't take much, though. As I said, we lack resilience. It doesn't take much to send shocks reverberating through the markets. Shocks reverberating through the way that we can do business. And we've weathered a lot of storms. It's good that we've done that, but we're pretty storm battered by this point. Underneath all this, competing geopolitical orders, and I'm sure someone will ask about the BRICS and challenges to the US and all the rest of it. I mean, the reality is the US view of the world remains the most dominant by a long way, but there are a lot of people who are attacking that, who would want you to believe that alternate systems are arguably more threatening and capable than they are. But you are seeing a change in the geopolitical order. The US-led hegemony, really led by goodwill towards the US that existed, has evaporated at this point. And while we focus on the big geopolitical divides, this offers a lot of smaller countries the opportunity to compete, to cut their own path in this situation, to find influence, to jockey for position between different alliances, not necessarily be constantly aligned with one bloc. Turkey is a great example of this, a NATO ally that's talking to Russia, also intervening in the Middle East in its own way. But there are many other examples, Saudi Arabia, another, ironically, even over the Yemen situation, Saudis have been at war with the Yemenis for a number of years, and yet, not really wading in the current situation because of the dynamics around Israel. These are not reliable partners. And I think the idea that alliances are immutable, other than probably NATO, but that has its own problems in agreeing on a single course of action because there's so many nations and the single nation veto. But the other nations, I think alliances are convenience, if you like, sort of consortia against a particular issue is going to be a more likely pattern that we'll see for the future. And underlying that, some big geopolitical views and contrasting geopolitical views of the world broadly between the more democratic states and the more authoritarian states, and what we like to call the axis of the excluded. So those states that aren't part of things, they're the those are the two big spheres. But within that, there's a lot of room for people to move, find their own path. You don't have to do things the US way anymore. It's kind of the feeling. It's what you sense on the international stage, and our adversaries, again, and those with different worldviews, spend a lot of time and effort focusing on some of those areas and building traction within the global South in particular, as to their worldview, and arguing the US worldview is over liberal, it's over woke, it's focusing on the wrong things. You should respect a strong man type leader, and they mean a strong man when they say it. Authoritarianism is to be preferred to Western anarchy and decadence. They push as well at religious buttons quite well, of course, and get traction for that. So again, the big picture is there. That's allowing a lot more maneuverability in the smaller picture. The fifth topic is rising tides of conflict and extremism. I won't labor that, but it follows some of the above. And we see that in the increased radicalization of people, whether they be a left-wing threat actor, a right-wing threat actor, a jihadist one, whatever you like. People are moving towards radicalization, in part to grip around a certain ideal. And in a way, the more challenging the world is, the less nuance we're capable of dealing with, the more we focus on single issues. And you see people focus very strongly on those. I mean, even the form of the environmental movement, people are sort of adopting an extremist position. And that's fed in part by my sixth theme, which is technology. The way in which technology is working, we got it wrong with social media. I'll be frank, I think we should always have treated these as publishing platforms by just allowing content to go out uncontrolled. And you see the effect of this again with what's happened with Twitter, now X, obviously being more and more controlled about responsibility on the platform, if you like. Elon Musk's argument that that was censorship and we should just get rid of all of that. And you kind of see the change for long-term Twitter users that we see now on the platform. Yeah, we got it wrong. And it allows threat actors, it allows bad people, it allows, frankly, idiots to spread views and causes problems. So those are the 6 themes, I think, underlying the world as we see it coming up. Number of challenges for business within all of that, but I'm interested at this point in your questions about that wonderful, cheerful future that we've outlined in general in those themes, and the way that things like AI and other technologies are going to change all of this. But the thought I'll leave you with is it's just making it come faster and faster. But thanks for your attention. And Martina, I think we have some questions, so more than happy to field those.
Right. Yes, thank you so much, Justin, for a very insightful presentation. Before we get to question, I just want to remind people to encourage everyone to go to the Q&A button on the bottom of the Zoom screen to enter your questions. Justin, pretty doomsday scenario there, but so are there any bright spots, but particularly from the global perspective, global business perspective? Do you see any bright spots besides the fact that leaders can prove themselves to, take charge?
Yeah. Again, for a number of nations, there are opportunities in this jockeying environment. It makes some of them into emerging markets. Turkey, for example, has turned the corner back again, I think, economically, and also in terms, arguably, of it being slightly pushed back in terms of global credibility over some concerns following the coup a number of years ago and the direction of leadership there. But actually now it looks positively benign compared to some other alternatives. And the reality is, in business, money has to go somewhere. And so people will start to find the least risky opportunities, and that in itself becomes a virtue because investment goes somewhere new. It brings about a change, hopefully increases stability and benefits new markets, new countries. So you are seeing some shifts towards different markets where people can find an opportunity, although again, a lot of risk averse at this moment, so they're stepping back. In terms of sectors, renewable energy, I mean, the future is towards, we need to be off fossil fuels. That is going to happen. It's a case of how long it's going to take, what we do in the meantime, what the best course of action is to get to that end state. But I think few of us would disagree that infinite free fusion power, it would be a bad thing for humanity. Clearly, anything that's moving towards renewables, towards more sustainable energy is going to be an advantage because especially if oil and gas supplies are increasingly imperiled, either because of extraction or actually potentially access with increased conflict, potentially in terms of shipping with increased conflict is pushing up prices. And of course, renewables become much more attractive in a period of high energy pricing. So if you accept uncertainty is coming up, then actually alternate forms of energy are probably going to get accelerated. Of course, some of that can be counter-cyclical. Cutting off Russian supplies has been really good for the US hydrocarbon industry, for example. But that's one of the areas I know that we are looking at because, I mean, there is a need to go that way. And actually, there's a practical reality that there's only so much oil you can use and it's going to start costing more and more money. And we're beholden to oil suppliers. And some of them have proven not to be very reliable partners, looking at Russia particularly, but potentially arguably Saudi Arabia and others. So energy independence is big for most countries. If you don't have oil and gas, what's your next alternative? Renewables. So we are seeing still an expansion in that, despite I think some cynicism over elements of electric cars and things like that. The other thing I think I would highlight, obviously, sadly, within that is the defense sector and technology sector within that. But there is, as ever, a lot of investment going into that. Now, some of the things that come out of accelerating defense spending, for example, high energy directed energy weapons, so lasers and things, and Israel going to start deploying lasers actually to protect against short range missiles being fired against Israel. I think that's one of the first operational deployments of laser systems in history. And the UK trialing some of those as well. The we're seeing an advancement in innovation, which is what often happens. That defense innovation comes first, the money gets spent on that, and then you do see benefits flow through to the rest of society. I admit that I can't immediately see the benefits to the rest of society of ginormous lasers. Maybe someone else can, and that's why you're at the School of Business, because you'll come up with a bright idea and make far more money than I ever will. But it's just one example. There's a lot of investment going into innovation. We've certainly seen it with drones, although ironically that was consumer innovation. Militaries didn't really get it and said consumer drones will never cut it on the battlefield. And ironically, they've affected the battlefield. But solutions in these new areas, particularly emerging technology areas, whether defense or otherwise, are definitely going to be attractive and moving quickly. And AI is the obvious one, but there's a lot more behind that. And I think it's what we do with AI. It's not the AI tools themselves.
Question from the audience. Do you think that today's citizens are naive when it comes to the risks that we are facing?
Yes, I think a number of people have been quite blinkered. I think they've also, many, and I don't want to say many people, you can't tell, because obviously a lot of people aren't posting on social media and they have their own opinions, but you do have the taxi driver test of getting a taxi and ask, what their view is of certain issues, and you can be quite surprised what comes back. I think a lot of people are quite misinformed, so they're very het up about things that are actually the policies and the things they talk about and would advocate for. For example, many admirers of Putin that one speaks to, where it's something that's entirely against their interests, and there's absolutely no way whatsoever that the person they're advocating for would have their interests in mind. And I see a lot of that. I mean, an extraordinary level of, if you like, partial information that's then been turned into a narrative and is focused on one-dimensional outcome, and it's extraordinary. It's sort of, if you like, almost it's having the queer community cheering for Islam and radical Islamism. It's sort of these things do not in any way support each other, but yet for some reason there is a faction or people that will focus on something like that. And it's a very niche example, but you sort of see these things emerge where people actually have widely embraced something that they have comparatively little understanding of and that actually wouldn't serve them at all. And yet this is something that affects their thinking. And of course, the problem you have when democracies have been so widespread and so successful is that arguably ill-informed people vote in all these countries. And that is one of the fundamental problems. I mean, we're arguably not educated enough, partly because we're oversaturated with information. We don't trust a lot of information, so we latch on to things that have an emotional reaction, and that doesn't mean we're making good decisions. So I think there is a naivety about the risks in the world. There is a naivety about the necessity to counter those risks. There is a focus on immediate things that don't actually matter very much, and there's an ignorance of long-term things that are going to matter a great deal. And it's very hard to see how one counters that. I mean, you'd think education, broadening horizons, variety of opinions. It doesn't seem to be getting any better. I'd say it's actually getting worse, that people are becoming more and more focused on one thing and often voting or acting around a single issue against mountains of evidence or other thinking. And there's that lack of critical thinking, I guess, that underpins this. And that's certainly what worries me, because our adversaries rarely seem to have the same problem, partly because it doesn't matter what the people think, because the people in charge of the countries that tend to be our adversaries make the decisions, and that's a small group, and they can agree on what they want to do and how they want to do it. It's also kind of hard for us being on top. We won the Cold War. We won everything. America, number one. American world order, number one. We're great. World business done the American way, the Western European, British, globalized way. Globalization is good. Liberal values are good. We won. We take it easy. We sit back. We relax. The people that lost in the past or perceive themselves to have lost or are being marginalized or victimized or being told they are by that worldview, of course, are going to have much more focus on overturning the status quo. We've got an interest in the status quo continuing, and we're very relaxed about it. So I'd say naive, lacking critical thinking, and far too complacent and relaxed about the situation. The fact that this stuff is going to come and bite us. Just because we've had 30 years comparative peace, I'm afraid we're going to have to deal with some challenges like every other generation always has done.
Mm-hmm. Another question. Hybrid warfare has become a household name, right? How can individuals and organizations prioritize their efforts facing all of these, this kind of a risk, going from climate, disease, technology, AI, automation? What is your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back almost to the previous question. I mean, in terms of our awareness of countering hybrid warfare threats, which is how I understand the question, a lot of it is being aware of what that looks like. You know, what does misinformation, disinformation look like? Why am I seeing a particular message? Who has an interest in pushing this message to me, and what might they seek to gain? I think one of the most current and interesting things is, of course, Tucker Carlson being in Moscow speaking to Putin. And if you want to see examples of things there, I mean, the way in which the trailer for that conversation has been positioned is absolute genius. I mean, I've got to bow down to the way in which they've managed to position this as, you know, that this is going to be some critical interview of Putin, and you know it's not. At a time that Putin won't speak to journalists in Russia or any main Western journalists. I mean, if someone's been invited to speak and they're having this conversation, I mean, it is staged. It's a platform for the Russian leadership. It's being phrased in a way that makes it look like it's for the American people, so they can just discover the truth about what's going on. Like, yeah, from the guy that lied about invading Ukraine in the first place. But you know, that is a form of hybrid warfare to get the US public, you know, watching this in particular, to say we shouldn't be supporting Ukraine. The Russians are the good guys in this. We're right. You know, it's how, and it can work. You know, this sort of messaging works, and this is a part of hybrid warfare. It's to push those alternative narratives and destroy our trust in our own decision making, our own leadership, create skepticism where there shouldn't be sometimes, and you know, it's far beyond a healthy challenge, but it's dressed up so well. So I think one of the key things to be aware of is that, in terms of countering misinformation through AI, it's a very interesting area because, of course, AI is generating huge amounts of misinformation. We saw that during the conflict in Gaza, particularly so many AI-generated images of things. I mean, luckily, still at the moment, AI is having a real problem with human hands, and any budding artists amongst you may recognize this as well. I mean, drawing hands is hard, and AI is finding it hard because generally a lot of the AI-generated images had too many arms or too many fingers on hands, and that was the giveaway. But you had to look increasingly close at these images to work out that actually, you know, there's something wrong. And the other problem is we're so oversaturated with information, people spend half a second looking at an image and respond to it. You know, people aren't looking at it, isolating it, thinking about it, because there's so much other information coming in that you just react and move on. So AI is increasing the threat from this. AI is, of course, a way to start analyzing it and defending it. So we almost need AI looking at stuff before we see it to say, this is made by another AI, you know. You should be more skeptical of this. So we need it on both sides, I think, to start countering the narrative. That's just in the information space. Obviously, within warfare, you have what we call various domains: land, sea, air are obvious, space, cyber, information. That's the information area. But of course, AI underpins all of our operations and the way in which we can make better decisions more quickly. And that's as true for business, of course, as it is for governments or the military, in terms of trying to crash huge amounts of data, bring it together, get some sort of insight and meaning out of it, and act on that. Of course, are we at a point yet that we would fully trust AI and autonomy to do that for us? Well, we actually do. And those of you who are in San Diego can probably look out of your window if you're anywhere near the harbor, and you'll see rafts of lovely grey ships that have huge amounts of AI on board and have done since the 1980s in order to control their systems on board, including last line defense against missiles, some of which have been used in the last couple of weeks by US warships off Yemen. Those are autonomously controlled, AI controlled when set to free fire. And they are evaluating threats, and they will engage when necessary. So we are already there, albeit in very safe domains like at sea, where obviously there's limited amounts that can go wrong. As we bring AI and automation towards drone warfare, for example, towards the land domain, obviously that's going to get more difficult. But in terms of how that's affecting us, I mean, the technology and the pace of it in general is, of course, driving all of those trends. And our adversaries are making use of current technology. I mean, Iran has done it by building cheap and cheerful drones, selling them to Russia at a huge markup. It came out this week quite how much Russia's paying for things that people estimated at $20,000, and it's more like 200,000. But that's a side note. But our adversaries are making use of emerging technology to overcome that conventional might that the US and its allies clearly still have. I hope I answered the question. I sense I rambled there. Sorry about that. Whoever asked
it. Great. Now, another question. How do you see the role of India now, the most populous country in the world with those two competing superpowers, China and US?
Yeah, India is another one of examples of those nations that's treading this line quite carefully. It's definitely seeking to be oppositional to China, or a counterweight to China. That was evident, actually. I went to Beijing and Delhi back to back, gosh, probably a decade ago plus now. And when I was in Delhi, everyone was talking about Beijing. It's all about Beijing, China this, China that. Interestingly, when you went to Beijing, no one talked about Delhi. It was just not interesting to them. But for India, very, very proximate challenge and a problem. India also a country, of course, that uniquely seems to have bad relations with every single one of its neighbors. There's no one adjacent to India with whom India gets on particularly well or particularly warmly. So it's certainly always had a sort of an atmosphere of self-reliance, which, of course, as such a large country, it can do and has done. It's always carved a somewhat independent path in foreign affairs. At the moment, though, acting as a counterweight to China in support of the US when it suits India. The most obvious example of India not wading in on the side of, if you like, the good guys, is over the invasion of Ukraine, where India did not condemn the invasion. I think that's one of the times it's most obvious that India would do its own thing. You couldn't take them for granted as an ally. They're a really good example of that shifting alliances. Absolutely, if it came to conflict with China, I sense would be in the corner with some of the rest of us to balance things. But otherwise, will cut its own details. So it's within BRICS, of course. But at the same time, they're kind of very on the edge of it, and they're very skeptical about it. And they certainly don't want to see it as a Chinese. They're not part of the Chinese world. They see India as its own power. And again, they'll move on global issues as suits India. And they're probably the biggest, most important nation doing that, frankly. But as I said, there are others like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, arguably the world's first environmental superpower in the form of Brazil, that are also doing the same. They can balance. You don't have to just do what the US says anymore, because you have options. And actually, by exercising those options, you might get a better deal out of the US. So again, flexible alliances, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, is possibly a way to look at the world.
I think we have time maybe for 2 more questions. What proactive measures can companies take to enhance the resilience that you were talking about earlier?
It comes down to understanding yourself and understanding the environment. And where it goes wrong is companies don't understand themselves well enough to see where there's a problem building up, and then they don't understand when the environment changes the impact it'll have on them. So when we talk about business intelligence as in understanding the business, it's so critical. If you know where your supply chain is and who your suppliers are, and you extend that model back around the world, you understand everything about how long it takes them to get product to you, their critical dependencies. Imagine a perfect world. You had all of that mapped out and you had complete awareness of world events. You'd have been able to get ahead of, say, escalation in the Red Sea and say, okay, well, this could increase our shipping time. So let's start stockpiling now, or let's start diversifying suppliers. On a more minor level, if you're aware of where health risks are beginning to generate, and I'm afraid we haven't seen the last pandemic, possibly even in this decade, let alone in the future. But if you can see where those health risks are manifesting, you can get ahead of that. You could, if you're a retail store, you can start stocking the right things in the right place at the right time. It's going to be an outbreak of flu in the southern US. Great. Well, let's make sure that we have lots of Kleenex on the shelves and cold medication available for people to buy, because they're going to want these things. Equally, anyone who had the market in protective equipment for medical supplies in 2020 is almost certainly not on this call, because they're very rich and retired and living on an island somewhere. So if you can get ahead of these things, you can avoid exposure, and you can not only have resilience, but you can also actually profit from getting ahead of events, understanding and stockpiling where necessary, getting the right product to the right place at the right time, understanding shifts in markets. There's an argument some companies could have seen the writing on the wall and what was happening with Russia 2 years ago before the invasion, and got clear of their Russian investments ahead of anything happening, rather than weeks afterwards, and potentially then having to fire sale those assets within Russia. And I knew a few companies that did get out ahead of things because they took a gamble. And that obviously then increased their resilience, because they avoided the thing. They could actually invest in other alternatives and move on. But really, for me, it comes down ultimately to the thinking of people. So you can have the intelligence on the world, you can have the intelligence on your business. You never get the crisis you plan for or expect. But if you train for a crisis, a scenario, it doesn't matter if it's the scenario, but you train for something credible, and you get people together and they communicate and they liaise and they plan together, and you come up with plans and options. When you get hit with the real crisis, everyone's used to what to do, and the team will work effectively. So you're never going to plan perfectly for what actually happens, but the exercise of planning for something means that you'll deal with what does happen better than you would have done otherwise, if that makes sense. So a lot of it is the academic preparedness. It's preparing teams for the fact that maybe things could change, and if they do, How are you going to react? What decisions are you going to make? Who's going to make them? How are you going to communicate? And how are you going to deal with it? And that really helps. And it's hugely overlooked, I think, a lot of businesses, to actually make your people resilient. Not just turning up to work and expecting the same 9 to 5, rather than having a truly resilient mindset, which is useful, of course, in seeking business opportunity as well. So lots of benefits.
Okay. Last question has to do with our students. What would be your advice to our graduating, seniors, graduating
Yes.
this May in this turbulent times? What would you tell them?
It probably hasn't changed from anything. I mean, you've definitely got a more interesting environment to come up with. The pressure is going to be on. Now, what that means is, I think, all the core things I always tell people, but are even more important. Being able to take ownership of tasks. I'm amazed that people come to the organization and they fall over on basic things like just being able to understand an assignment, take it away, break it down, manage it, work out when you need to get back to people, work out who you need to talk to, work out where you can take responsibility to get something done. The amount of times you give a task to someone who doesn't even know how to start it, they never tell you they don't know how to start it, and they sit on it probably with a sinking feeling in their stomach rather than seeking advice, is really marked. And some of that, of course, I think, is the effect of being distant from your colleagues in the office. It makes it harder to be able to grab someone and say, how do I do this? Justin's asked me to do this. I didn't want to say I didn't really understand, but how do I do this? Where do I get started on this? Can you give me some thinking? So we lack that mentorship now, and it makes it much harder to go. So you need to have a very high sense of self-accountability and ownership beyond anything else. The second thing is soft skills in general. Again, I think for the same reason, but I'm amazed at some of the emails I get from job seekers. Truly extraordinary sort of emails, very demanding emails. And they don't go down very well with my recruiting team, I can tell you as well. It's funny. I mean, the office soft skills definitely seem to be missing the ability to interact effectively with people, to influence, to listen. Definitely is one of the areas we haven't do a lot of training for people that join our organization because they just don't seem to have learnt it. Again, COVID may be to blame, but I think I look back on my own behavior and I probably sucked at it myself. It's 30 years ago. Wisdom has given me, an advantage in hindsight, but we can all be better at our soft skills, and they really count for a lot in getting things done, which is all that matters in business. Can you get things done? Right? It's all about getting things done. Strategy is easy, and we can all talk about strategy, get things done. And the final part really is psychology and leadership. And we talk about leadership, but it's very badly exercised in general in businesses and in civilian life. You can always be better at it. It comes down to empathy. You care for and value your team and your people. You give them a mission and purpose, they will perform. And, that is rewarded. And a lot of that as well as psychology. It's underpinning the psychology of your team. It's underpinning the psychology of your clients. And it's unpicking the psychology of your peers and bosses and others. Putting yourself in customers' shoes, putting yourself in your team's shoes. And that's really important in business. And of course, it's hugely important, I think, in understanding the world. This all comes down to psychology. It's large groups of people making decisions, particularly in this electoral year. And we make decisions based on our psychology, ultimately, however much we think we don't. If you can understand individuals as leaders and groups of people as people driving the economy or political events, then it's all to the good. So I think if there's one skill you should learn more throughout life, it's how other people work, because even with the rise of the machines, we're going to spend a lot of time dealing with each other. So whatever it's worth, that's my little bit of advice. And take it or leave it. It was free, so you get what you pay for, which is the other lesson you should learn.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Justin, for joining SDSU and for providing us valuable update on today's eventful global risk environment. We certainly look forward to having you back again. I would like to thank all the many people who have joined us today. I encourage all of our guests to stay connected with us. Please learn more about the Fowler College and our Wendy Gillespie Center for Advancing Global Business. I encourage you to visit our website. We hope that you'll attend our future online events, which are promoted on our social media at SDSU Fowler, and also on our website, business.sdsu.edu. These will be posted in the chat box. Thank you again. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you all for your attention. Stay safe.
Thank you.